Welcome to the conference, Evil, Suffering, and the Global Pandemic. Let me introduce myself. I am Mohammed Farouk, and I'm the principal investigator of this project and conference entitled Evil, Suffering, and the Global Pandemic. So let me begin by sort of thanking our donors. So this conference is made possible to organize through the generous support of the Templeton Foundation, and the grant is given to us through the Global Philosophy of Religion Project, University of Birmingham. So we'd like to thank both of these institutions, and we'd also like to thank the organizing institutions, namely the University of Cincinnati, and also Carleton University, and all the staff, all the people who have really helped us putting this together. So this is a really unique conference because we really have a wonderful, and you might have noticed, really a great lineup of speakers, people who are from, people who have degrees or who are from really top-ranked universities from North America and Europe. And they have expertise in different areas. So we're really looking forward to all the talks. And we also have a great audience. And this audience, so we already have over 300 people who have registered for the conference. And they really come from all walks of life. And when I say all walks of life, I really mean that literally, because I've noticed there are people whose professions may be here. They may be businessmen, financiers, health professionals, physicians, scholars, scientists, and people working at Google, and people who teach or study at Harvard University, University of Cambridge. So it's a really, really, it's a really varied, diverse audience. But I would say mostly non-academic people. And this conference is actually organized for non-academics more than the academics, although we are all academics. But the goal is to really speak to a wider audience. So the nature of the talks are going to be a mix of academic and non-academic reflections on the pandemic. Now, this is still an ongoing thing. You know, the COVID-19, it's still raging, and it's so we're still coping with this. So there's definitely, obviously, the technical, more scientific aspects to this issue. Obviously, with the vaccine and all that, we first need to think about surviving. But there are also more issues that people would categorize as psychological or quote unquote mental, very problematic term, or spiritual, or sometimes religious, or even philosophical. You know, so that's where. And those issues and those dimensions of the problem, that is the pandemic, are also extremely important. So this conference comes in exactly in that area where we can think about the issue from a more psychological, spiritual, philosophical, and religious perspectives. But I also have to make it very clear: this is not exactly. This is not, all the talks are not exactly going to be quote unquote religious in the sense of providing simply religious kind of prescriptive advice. It's going to be more like constructive reflections. Also, let me also mention that there's going to be an edited volume based on all the talks. We already received most of the drafts, and the edited volume is going to be published by University Press and will be made available to the wider public at some point. And also the talks are going to be recorded, and they'll be posted online as well. All right, with that, let me hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Professor Rustam, who is really the man behind the screen. He has really put all these strings. I'm just, yeah, so Professor Rustam, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for this wonderful introduction to the conference. And Mohammed, he downplayed the role that he's been very much involved with this whole thing, and it's the other way around. Actually, he had the wrong Mohammed in mind when he was speaking a moment ago. It's so nice to see all of you. So many of you are friends, familiar faces. Some of you are joining us from, like Mohammed was saying, all across the world. I see people from Karachi, from Tanzania, and those are two places that I have roots. So that warms my heart as well. And then of course colleagues, and I read the one person named Muhammad Farouk, just like the name of Muhammad, the conference organizer, but it's spelled differently. And I thought, so there's at least two Muhammad Farouks attending here, and I saw two Hillary Papworths as well at one point coming. So that's nice that you're coming and your twins are also attending. Now, it's kind of strange because when you introduce a conference on evil and you're doing it through the Zoom medium, the obvious thing that strikes you is that the medium itself, it's quote unquote kind of an evil, isn't it? Or lesser of two goods, let's just say, lesser of two evils, let's just say. Much better if we were all in person doing this, but we have to go with whatever is given to us. And in the absence of water, you use dust. So we're using the Zoom medium, and that's no problem at all. Hopefully we'll still be able to hear all of these fascinating lectures. Muhammad has really said everything that needs to be said in terms of the scope of the conference, but I wanted to add one or two observations, kind of, things that motivated the thinking behind the conference and the volume that's coming out of it. One of which was that, normally we hear of discussions in philosophy of religion, but they usually are framed. I mean, things are changing now thanks to the work of people like Tim Knepper and others. They normally are framed within a Christian analytic, theological, philosophical framework. And so the problem sets largely are alien to people from other faith traditions, or they don't exactly match up. And I remember when I was a student, an undergrad student, I took a course in philosophy of religion only to learn that it was really Christian philosophy of religion. And I learned a lot, of course, but it left me wondering, what is there a Hindu philosophy of religion? Is there an Islamic philosophy of religion? If it is, what does it look like? So that led me down avenues that took me to classical texts. And then, of course, we're contemporary people. And so we also asked the question, what about contemporarily? Do Muslims, in this case, have something to say about philosophy of religion, topics that traditionally are defined as the stuff of philosophy of religion? And if so, what? And how are they different and how are they similar to the normal field that we take for granted as constitutive of the stuff of philosophy of religion? And one of the things that emerged through our conversations was that if you look at Islamic philosophical writings, they come in so many different forms, as people like Cyrus Zargar, our next speaker, has shown. Many of these concerns are cast through literature and also through dense metaphysical treatises, through poetry, through art, and through so many different kinds of media, that if you look at the Islamic philosophical tradition's response to these kinds of problems, and you try to draw on it as a contemporary thinker, the resources are embarrassing, actually. We have so many different approaches and so many creative responses to the questions that we're used to. So framed within a contemporary context in a pandemic, post-pandemic age, it behooves us to consider these resources. And so each of the conference participants is going to say something different about the problem because they look at it from very different disciplinary perspectives within the Islamic intellectual tradition. And at the same time, they're not treating it exclusively as a historical problem. That's a thing that Muslims need to really get out of, is this kind of, ghettoization or interdisciplinary boondocks where we're just always stuck answering questions as historians, but never treated or looked at or see ourselves as contemporary thinkers. And we have no reason to behave that way. There have been many wonderful examples amongst contemporary Muslim scholars who've already paved the pathway for us, the most prominent of whom will be our keynote speaker within a few hours. So this is all to say that this is to keep the discussion open and going, and to also introduce all of us to new perspectives on the question of evil, suffering, and the pandemic. I should also like to say something about the structure of the conference as it's going to unfold over the next 3 days. Generally, what will happen is it'll be organized as you've seen on timetable. We have our first panel that'll be led by a chair who I'll introduce in a moment. And then the speaker will have about 30 minutes to give their presentation. And then we'll pause for a 15-minute question and answer session with that speaker. And the questions, I think the most logical and easiest way to do it would be through writing your questions. If there's a consensus that you want to do it through, orally, you want to ask your questions, then we can also provide for that. But I think that probably the easiest way to do it would be just to allow this chair to field your questions by writing them into the chat box and sending them that way. And now we'll continue like that. Then we have our lunch break, and then after that will be our keynote speaker, and then the rest of the conference will move along following the same structure that I've just laid out for you. Now, let me say something about our chair, Professor Saïd Sami. Speaking of whom, we're very honored to have her. Had again, this been in person, she would have been just next door. So that would have been really nice. But at least she was able to join us and take time out of her busy schedule. Professor Maysami is an associate professor of Islamic philosophy at the University of Dayton. And she has 2 PhDs, one in analytic philosophy from the University of Tehran, and one in Islamic philosophy from the University of Toronto. So she comes very well prepared to adjudicate these sessions, at least in the morning for us. She's written many books on Mullah Sadra, on Kirmani, on Nasruddin Tusi. She's currently writing an introduction to Islamic philosophy for my series with Equinox and Global Philosophical Traditions. And her most recent book is this one on Nasruddin Tusi, which I'm going to hold up for you, just to really embarrass her. There it is, lovely title, an amazing book and wonderful exposition, a historical, textual, analytic exposition of Nasruddin Tusi's worldview. Without further delay, I will give the floor over to Saya to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
You did embarrass me, Mama. Thank you so much. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to chair all our morning panels over the course of the conference. There are lots of interesting things to listen to. As Dr. Oslam said, please type your questions in the chat box, and I will get to them within the confinement of the 15 minutes that we have after each talk. So I'll start with the first one, and then in the order of appearance of the questions, we go down the list. We have 2 presentations in the first panel, one by Dr. Cyrus Ali Zargar, who is Al-Ghazali Distinguished Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Central Florida. His first book, Sufi Aesthetics, Beauty, Love, and Human Form in Ibn Arabi and Iraqi, was published in 2011 by the University of South Carolina Press. His most recent book, The Polished Mirror, Storytelling and the Pursuit of Virtue in Islamic Philosophy and Sufism, was published in 2017 by One World. And his forthcoming book, Religion of Love, Sufism, and Self-Transformation in the Poetic Imagination of Attar, will be published by the Islamic Text Society. So we have something wonderful to look forward to. Our second panelist is Hina Khalid. She's a PhD student at the Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge, where she also received her undergraduate and MPhil degrees. She's working on a comparative study of the theology and poetry of Muhammad Iqbal and Tagore. She is particularly interested in the possibilities of comparative theology across Islamic and Indic traditions, and in the ways that shared devotional idioms have the shared devotional idioms have formed in and across the Indian subcontinent. Her previous publications have centered on a range of topics, including issues of embodiment, gender, and spirituality across the Christian, Islamic, and Indic worldview. Our first talk by Dr. Zargar is titled Suffering as Metaphysical Narrative, Another Author's Story. And the title of the paper by Hina Khalid, Sacred Somatics, well, it's very beautiful, Sacred Somatics, an Islamic Perspective on the Role of the Body in the Care of the Dying. So I leave you to these 2 wonderful presenters and hope you all enjoy. Dr. Zargar.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Masoni. And if I start to get to 25 minutes, you could just sort of give me a little signal, because I won't see it. I'm going to share the screen as well. If the host could either make me a co-host or enable screen sharing, please. Thank you. So, let's do this. All right. Does everything look okay? You see my first slide? Thank you. All right, so Suffering is Metaphysical Narrative, another author's story. Last summer, I was at the home of relatives who had lost their 23-year-old son to leukemia. While they had their moments of calmness and even joviality, for the most part, as one would expect, they were distraught and inconsolable. Their son was in many ways a pillar of their family, a bodybuilder and an entrepreneur, a person of great charm who had married only months before his sudden diagnosis precipitated quickly. The young man's grandmother was at this gathering. In a room crowded with those who had come to express condolences, the grandmother looked directly at me. During a rare moment of silence. She asked me loudly so that all could hear, "What can you say to Reza's mother and father to comfort them? You're a professor of religion. Say something to ease their pain." I had nothing to say. There was no response that I could give that did not feel either forced or somehow emotionally manipulative, as though I wanted to coax them out of a grief that was more than warranted. At moments like these, I never know what to say. I usually stand or sit silently and do my best to mutter something about my sympathies while feeling inside a dual sense of respect and empathy, tinged with feelings of guilt and gratitude that I am not in their place. Here, though, in this paper, I would like to give those parents the best response I can. What follows is not so much a philosophical argument as it is a reframing, a shift in perspective that has helped me at such times. In other words, I offer nothing more than my own humble means of perseverance. It begins with the conviction that life has some meaning to it. Moreover, human life specifically results from acts of creation. I do not mean in any way to disavow scientific claims about the universe or the evolution of species, theories with which I am perfectly comfortable, even as they remain unrelated to the topic at hand. Rather, I want to call on a sense of intuition that I have and share with others, a conviction that there is some purpose behind my life and the lives of those around me. In fact, I will go beyond merely a sense of purpose and say that if viewed as part of a position or an act of authorship, my life has an author. Informing my views of human life as authored are the ethical and literary perspectives of two great thinkers, one classical, the other more contemporary. The first is the 13th century Spanish Sufi theorist, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, and the second is 20th century Russian literary critic, Mikhail Bakhtin. And I'm going to, before I go to my next slide, I'm just going to see if I can turn off this this sound. Hold on one second. Let's see here. Go back. Let's see. Well, I don't know if there is a way. Oh, here. I'll mute. You could still hear me, right?
Yes.
And not. I can't hear you. What I've done is I've muted myself. I've muted my actual speaker. So, while you can't hear me, I can. I mean, you can hear me. I can't hear you. So, the warning that I mentioned is of no use now. I won't hear you anymore until the end. Okay. Going back to the two sources of influence in this paper, the first is Ibn Arabi. And from Ibn Arabi, I draw the idea that creation exists for me as a rich and multi-layered experience of imagination. There is first my own imagination that allows me to perceive things and know things in a human way, constructed using my own sensory input, the sensory input that I have received from my infancy until today. My sense of imagination has constructed a world that makes sense to me, yet it is no fantasy. The world that makes sense to me is a world of forms that communicate supersensory meanings. Beyond all of this, beyond my own perception and my own imagination, lies what you might call, to put it very simply, the imagination of God. Everything I know and see is maintained by this transcendent knower of everything. Were God to divert his attention from anything, including myself for even an instant, I would cease to be. In this way, God is a constant author and viewer of my reality. I call on Bakhtin because I live in a modernity that gave me what some might argue is contemporary literature's greatest gift to human cultures, namely the novel. The novel has changed the way we perceive our world. Relatedly, the novel has also resulted from changes in the language that we use to understand our world. For Bakhtin, the novel comes to be in a setting wherein the rigidity of language as supported by power structures, begins to break down, succumbing to diverse voices, genres, worldviews, and dialects, a breakdown in the world outside the novel reflected within the novel. So authority breaks down into this kind of multiplicity. One might think of the epic poem, to give an example, structured both as verse and as a single authorial voice, as contrasting with the novel. If you think of the epic poem, for those who literature people, they know this is the greatest monument of pre-modern literature, especially in the European cultures, was the epic poem. This shift in literature describes quite well the transition that many communities made from feudal agrarian life to that centered around the city, or what we might call the onset of modernity. For Bakhtin, the novel presents a pluralism of all perspectives contained in it. Each voice in the novel brings its own orientation and even philosophy. There is an author, of course, in the novel, but the author exists only as a careful curator of various perspectives, so much so that he or she has all but disappeared in many novels, or at least those that have the quality that Bakhtin calls heteroglossia. In its fullest effect, heteroglossia leads to dialogism, which is a modality of knowledge in which the convergence of multiple dialogues creates meaning. Bakhtin's reflections on the novel, on literature, and the relationship between author and hero in ways that are sometimes surprisingly relevant to readers of Ibn Arabi is what I'll be focusing on. He tells us about the relationship, to give an example, in classical literature between fate and the hero. Classical literature, such as that of the Greeks, as well as Persian heroic poetry, presents us with a hero who should be doomed, or who should feel doomed. It accomplishes that by giving us an author who avoids offering any moral frame of reference or perspective. So you can see there's a relationship between the author and the hero. So imagining an author other than the self for one's life has a twofold quality that becomes clear through Bakhtin's literary theory. First, it creates a sense of predetermined fate or doom. Yet second, it also liberates the hero from being the author. Thus, the author's determination of the course of the hero's life bestows upon the hero both meaning and beauty. So here I'm reading directly from Bakhtin's essay, Author and Hero. A determined life, a life freed from the claws of what is yet to be, of the future, of purpose and meaning, such a life becomes emotionally measurable, musically expressive, and self-sufficient, sufficient to itself as totally present on hand. Its being already determined becomes a valuable determinateness. Meaning is not born, nor does it die. The meaning-governed sequence or progression of one's life, that is, the cognitive ethical tension of a lived life from within itself, can be neither started nor consummated. Death cannot be the consummation of this meaning-governed progression. So, by freeing the hero from having to create his or her own meaning, the author has located a superseding sense of meaning beyond the hero's particular frame of reference. The hero exists within a context of meaning, and that meaning neither comes to be with the hero nor dies with the death of the hero. I hope that's clear. The hero's narrative becomes an opportunity to witness the lasting beauty of a transitory window into meaning, one window among many. This sense of an author other than oneself for the role one plays in the story of life, I am arguing, can liberate us from having to be the authors of our own individual stories. Suffering too then becomes framed within a larger context of meaning that contains each of us. Now, what I found interesting that works with all this is that for Bakhtin, there's the theory of the soul and the self that works with all of this. And I think this will be really interesting, especially for those in Islamic studies. The soul for Bakhtin is the self in dialogue. The soul is that part of the self that comes to be within the contexts of its interactions and experiences among others. The spirit, on the other hand, is the culmination of meanings acquired in that dialogue with others, acquired in life, one might say. So here I quote again from Bakhtin. I experience the inner life of another as his soul. Within myself, I live in the spirit. The soul is an image of the totality of everything that has been actually experienced, of everything that is present on hand in the soul, in the dimension of time. The spirit is the totality of everything that has the validity of meaning, a totality of all the forms of my life's directedness from within itself, of all my acts of proceeding from within myself. So we might say the spirit is far beyond anything that can be described in story. Because for Bakhtin, the spirit remains constantly receptive. It does not give back. The author for Bakhtin creates representationally that soul-spirit dynamic in the novel by giving the character souls, which then lends the novel spirit. The author, in other words, recreates in the novel the world that we all know in life, the life in which we interact with others. Thinking about Bakhtin's theory, I can begin to see my own life and the events within it, not as centered around me, but as part of a larger story that contains me. My story is not really a story at all. It is a role in which I interact with others, creating one dialogue, one conversation among multiple conversations that form the story of our collective novel, the story of reality. The story has an author. Now, I would call that author God. Importantly, though, I am not that story's hero because it is not my story. Remember, it's the story of humanity itself. Thinking about Ibn Arabi's description of the Quran, we might say that while I'm a soul within that story, the spirit of that story is the Quran. So here, Ibn Arabi tells us that, and I'm quoting, the Quran unveils all the knowledges sent down in the scriptures and contains that which is not contained by them because Muhammad was given the all-comprehensive words, Jawami al-Kalim, which means that the sciences of the prophets, the angels, every known tongue are comprised in the Quran itself. That is the meaningful dimension of our existence has been summarized in the Quran, and the Quran itself declares that it contains the most beautiful of stories. Placing one's life within the context of a story often means something different from what I have described. If you've heard the story of my life or thinking about one's own narrative, usually in modern contexts, we are encouraged to focus on our own unique story with oneself as author. This, however, seems to create more discontent and disappointment when life presents a person with events and circumstances that do not fit the narratives we think we choose or create. In fact, so argues the American theologian Stanley Hauerwas. Hauerwas is interested in the way that Americans, particularly those who live within a framework of what might be called modernity, see themselves as the author of their own story. The extent to which I might choose my occupation, select a mate, time the births of my children, and generally describe my own identity, all this is indicative of a modern and American outlook, according to Hauerwas, and you can see it here. This is from Hauerwas's War and the American Difference. America exemplifies what I call the project of modernity, the attempt to produce a people who believe that they should have no story except the story that they chose when they had no story. That is what Americans mean by freedom. The institutions that constitute the disciplinary forms of that project are liberal democracy and capitalism. Americans presume that they have exercised their freedom when they get to choose between a Sony or Panasonic television. The same presumption works for choosing a president. It is assumed that you should only be held accountable when you acted freely. Okay? And to act freely, you had to know what you were doing. One of the difficulties with such an account of responsibility, for example, is that it makes marriage unintelligible. To explain, the problem derives from the fact that those ways of defining oneself, those ways of writing my own story always lead to disappointment, or almost always lead to disappointment. So, ending on the marriage example, the person whom I married 20 years ago will not be the same person with whom I'm married today. Therefore, I can never say that I chose to be married to this person. Moreover, the children that I have will invariably grow up to be individuals entirely outside of my domain of influence. I cannot choose my children in terms of their identities. They just happen to intersect with my life. This way of thinking of my story as my own story, me as the author of my own story, leads to frustrations as well as futile attempt after futile attempt to reassert myself, trying to rewrite things, revise matters so that I might be that author I imagine. At best, I fool myself into thinking that I am the author of my own story as well as its hero. At worst, I suffer a crisis of identity, one that brings me to reject any meaningful theory of life. When that story, the story of the self that is both a modern and American, does happen to work out, I see my successes as part of my story. I sense that I have earned those successes. Conversely, I begin to see all trials as matters that I should rightly be able to control. A person might say, for example, upon getting sick, that I must rise to the occasion, to be at war with my sickness. In reality, there is often very little that I can do to predict my own longevity other than staying in the best health that I can. Once I begin to see the author of my story as someone else, and once I begin to see myself not as the hero, but as one voice or one soul within that story, my perspective shifts considerably. I would argue that this difference in perspective appears in the Qur'an as well. Take the case of Abraham. When Abraham wants to describe God, he describes him in terms of the interventions God has made within his life. This is from the 26th chapter, 26th surah. The one who created, this is Abraham describing God. The one who created me, then he guided me. And the one who fed me and gave me drink. The one who, when I was sick, healed me. The one who will bring me death, then return me to life. And the one whom I hope will forgive me of my faults on the day of the criterion. The way that Abraham knows God is through these major events that he shares with other people. His knowledge of God is as an author or as a causal factor in the important times of his life, as well as the more quotidian life. Recognizing God's activity orients him toward God, but I would add, at least for the purposes of this paper, that it orients him away from concern for his own ability to act. Such a perspective orients Abraham away from blaming himself for what he cannot control or for taking credit for what he did not control. Instead, he maintains hope in what is completely beyond any human being's control. He begins to see his life as one life among many, a life that makes sense. This yields gratitude as well as a sort of trusting resignation. When he was sick, it was up to God to heal him. If God had decided not to heal him, then he would have remained sick or worse, perished. Had either of those things happened, not only would he have been affected, but all those who loved him would be affected as well. Within this scriptural context, those who love him include generations of saintly men and women. It includes both the children of Israel and the tribes of the Arabs. It includes all monotheists within the Western religions, in fact, because his role in this larger story is that of a grand soul. The dialogue that he has had with others, the voice that he shared with those around him, was a major theme in the novel of existence. Another case in the Qur'an of particular significance is that of a dialogue between God and Moses. When Moses comes before God, he fears appearing alone at the court of the Pharaoh. He asks God to make his brother, Aaron, his partner in this act of prophetic bravery. God grants his request.
This is very
that
good.
reminds Moses of the
Mashallah.
favors he has done for him throughout his life. And here I quote from the 20th chapter of the Quran, 20th surah of the Quran. He said, this is God's answer to Moses' prayer. We have granted your request, O Moses, and we favored you another time before, when we revealed to your mother what we revealed. Put him in the chest, and the chest on the open water, so that the water will bring him to the bank. An enemy to me and to him will take him. And I bequeathed a love upon you from myself, so that you would be brought up before my eyes. Recall when your sister was walking. So she said, shall I lead you to one who can care for him? So we returned you to your mother to bring tranquility to her eyes, and so she would not grieve. And you killed a person. And so we rescued you from sorrow and tested you in many ways. Thus you passed years among the people of Midian. Then you came to me at the arranged time, O Moses. Fascinating here is that the events in Moses' life become reframed, each as acts of grace, and the entirety of his life becomes described as God's abiding presence. At every turn, God was there, making sure things went the way they were supposed to go. Moreover, that story is not entirely about Moses, just as Moses' life is not entirely about Moses. The passage also concerns his mother and his sister. It is also about his enemies and his friends. Each of them has some effect upon the other, and each of their lives is changed because of Moses. Again, as with Abraham, we have another major voice, another major, we could say, theme in this grand story. Moses, like Abraham, recognizes God's role in his life. We know this because he asks God to change the story, supplicating for God to alter things, which is within the realm of possibility for God and only God. While we might remain powerless to change our role, we can direct our attention to its author, asking him to alter it. The story, after all, is being written, even if it has also been written before. Within that larger story of existence, Moses is a powerful example of someone who is heroic, but cannot be called the hero of the story. So I'm about to move to the conclusion, but I'm going to unmute my speaker so I can see how have I gone over time. I think I'm good, right? I think it's about 20 minutes, 22 minutes.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. We might say, moreover, that the narrative we are a part of is a narrative beyond what we can understand. Because it lies beyond what we can understand, it becomes difficult for us to locate benevolence at all times. We cannot see the story in its entirety. We can only see our own role in it. Even then, we stand imperceptive to the story's conclusion because we do not know what happens after death to us. This sense of resignation within the context of a grand story appears in the Qur'an. When one looks for it, one finds it everywhere in the text. For example, those who face calamity, according to the Qur'an, are instructed to declare, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Indeed, we belong to God, and to him we return. One might say for our purposes here, indeed we are from God, and to him we return. This is the barest structure of the grand story. Notice, first of all, the use of the first person plural. It is not, I am from God, and to God I return. Rather, we, humanity, who are from God, return. While we might return upon our deaths at different times, and then after death again together, the point is that humanity comes from God and goes to God. It implies the narrative began and how the narrative ends. Our solace is in knowing that there is a narrative and that the narrative is beyond our control, that the author is, as described in the Qur'an, merciful and loving. The perspective prescribed to the Qur'an's followers is one of indefatigable hope. This is because the superseding narrative containing each believer's role has been established as a meaningful and even beautiful one. So declared the Prophet Muhammad in a well-known narration, and I quote, "How wondrous is the affair of the believer. The believer's affair is entirely good, and this is something that applies to no one but the believer." So the belief of the believer yields an affair, al-amr, or one might say a role in life's narrative that is good, it's khair, regardless of the particular circumstances of that life. And here it continues, knowing this, when stricken by prosperity, the believer is grateful. When stricken by hardship, the believer is steadfast. This is good for the believer. Many believers die in abject poverty after decades of strife or ill health. Some of those who embrace this narrative, those who are quote unquote believers in it, suffer constantly, at least externally, even if in some cases their cores remain unshaken. Their belief lies in an understanding of the goodness of their affair. That is, they know the outline of the larger, beautiful story. On one hand, the Quran and Hadith promise a recompense for such suffering, and this is from another Hadith. God the Almighty will apologize to his servants who are needy in this world, just as a brother apologizes to his brother and say, I swear by my honor that I did not make you poor to humiliate you. Now push aside the curtain and see what I have given you instead. When the curtain is pushed aside and he sees what God has awarded him with instead of this world, he says, oh God, there was no harm for me due to what you took away from me, considering what you have given me instead. This, and I conclude, this is the prevailing sentiment in Islamic scriptures regarding human suffering. Nevertheless, we might read such narrations slightly differently than the surface reading, this time focusing less on recompense than on a sense of belonging. The grand narrative contains all of us, and our experience of prosperity or hardship reflects only our place within that narrative. If at any particular moment the author of that story does not seem benevolent, we have been guaranteed that at the end he will. This brings me back to my relatives who have lost their son in the prime of his life. Their role in this grand narrative continues, as on some level does their son's. My role has intersected with theirs at this very moment. We can together find solace in the fact that we share this narrative because the narrative has brought us together. It has bound us by love. a love we would not have known without the history and family ties that made it possible, namely the intersecting roles that we have. This certainly might not serve as any consolation, nor does it seem to function as a full-fledged response to the problem of suffering. At the very least, however, it reminds us that our suffering exists within the context of meaning and purpose. It places our lives within a framework of meaning that towers above us and outlives us. Finally, it brings our intersecting dialogical roles together, relegating the encumbrance of answerability to another author, an author other than ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zargar. What a beautiful presentation. We have questions here. Okay, I can see one question already. Could we not say that God is not only the author of the story, but the true hero, the true spirit, and that all pieces are the various personas in literature masks of this grand narrative?
I like that. Yes, I think that's beautiful.
I mean,
metaphysical level, yes. But then for us, the coming and the going, the process of becoming, that's us. But yeah, it's a beautiful reading.
And the second question is from Rose. Whereas the reward is in the hereafter, how does one continue to live? Sorry, this moves. To live in this life in hardship?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to defer the answer because there's so many papers coming up, and this is the first. And I don't know if I was clear enough. This is something that I've never been able to answer. And part of it for me, just from a perspective of honesty, is that it's a really difficult question to answer when you're not the one in that position of suffering. You know, it's like a friend of mine made a joke about how, you know, when so things are going wrong for you, someone will say, "Oh, you're worrying about it too. Don't worry about it." And it doesn't sound like much of a joke now. It was funny when he said it, but you know, but then when it happens to them, they tend to be the ones who complain the loudest. You know, so it's hard to say how this affects one's life. But I would say that in action, I've seen this. I knew another family whose son was electrocuted. It was a horrible mishap that happened at his work. He worked at a really dangerous site. But what amazed me was I saw them like 4 days after the event, and they seemed okay. I mean, they seemed fine. And the reason why I think that's the case is that life makes sense to some people. And the reason it makes sense to some people is because of this narrative. And you see it not just among Muslims, but among others. So again, I'll defer the answers with so many different answers to that question coming up. But in action, it works.
Thank you very much. We have another question, and we still have time, from Nicholas. Thank you so much for this, Cyrus. Beautifully thought out and articulated, and a crucial corrective to a very common way of thinking, certainly here in the US. I wonder if it is necessary to have a completely either or approach to the question of cosmic narrative and individual narrative. Perhaps one can see it with two eyes here. After all, the cosmos is a book and the soul is a book. This would help us balance trust and effort. So it's a question and a comment.
Yeah, and it's a great one. It's a great one because you don't want to go so far as to somehow dismiss any sense of the decision-making process, moral judgment, culpability, responsibility, all of that. Even autonomy, you don't want to dismiss that. So I think that makes a lot of sense to see it as your own book, your own soul is a book for sure, and within that narrative you have decisions to make. I think that's a very nice addition, to this.
Thank you. And we have a nice comment from Nasir that everybody can see. So I move on to the question by Albert. Can the creativity of God be somehow delimited by the creativity of the knowing and feeling subject? Is there a dilemma here?
That's a really good question. So let me look, let me see if I can see it in here, and can the creativity of God be somehow delimited by the creativity of the knowing and feeling subject? Is there a dilemma here? Isn't this, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, this is the whole Mu'tazili, Ash'ari debate, I mean, about human will. And this is a really good question. You know, to what extent does my creativity infringe upon God's absolute creativity, you know? Or is it rather, going back to the very first comment, God being the hero of the story? I mean, that might be a solution, that my creativity is a facet of God's creativity, and that my soul, the writing of the book of my soul, is in fact simply a smaller version of, of God's book of the soul, you know. It's a theme within that book of the soul, and I do sense myself writing it and creating it, but at the same time, it exists within this larger book, no matter what I do, right? I know it's not an answer, but I'm just I think we're all just, spitballing here, just I think so.
I found it very satisfactory, your answer. Thank you.
Yes.
That was wonderful. As was your talk. Thank you very much.
So we have also a question from Ahmad. Do you think seeing ourselves more interdependent might help us cope with suffering better? Referring your Hauerwas quote. How does one balance between individualism and social interdependence?
I'm so glad you asked that, because in my personal and humble experience, the people who do this best don't try to do it. The reason they don't try to do it is because they're usually, I've seen very often, living in a context that supports it. So I'm not necessarily talking about even living in a traditional society. They might be living in a traditional society where this is much easier. I mean, it's much easier for me to see myself as part of a larger story when there are a good 100 people who I interact with on a let's say bi-weekly basis. I don't go into my little hut, and everybody else is fake and digital and I'm real, right? I don't, when I live in that kind of setting, it's a lot easier for me not to get caught up in the idea that I'm somehow this grand author, right? When I say that you don't have to live in a traditional society, I actually, I had this interesting opportunity. I was traveling, and we were looking for a place to pray, and we ended up at this mosque. And it turned out that it was really interesting that two sons who had grown up and lived there their whole life were leaving for the first time to go study in Texas. I didn't know that there was like a seminary in Texas, a Muslim seminary in Texas, but there was. And the whole community had gotten together to say goodbye to them. And what was fascinating to me, because I didn't know who anybody was, but I listened to the whole thing, was the way, as you heard them recount stories of their father who had passed away and their mother who had raised them, what I began to realize is that this community had recreated within the confines of maybe 10 miles of this mosque, a traditional society. They would see each other every day. They would interact with each other every day. They'd play sports, and if you were missing one day, someone asked where you were, right? I mean, how many cases do you have in contemporary society if there's someone dying in their apartment? And I'm sorry to disturb everyone, but people not finding out until until it's really become horrible, right? So I think one of the things that helps is this is a practical issue. There is a theoretical side to it, but when you're talking about practical philosophy, practice matters. So living within a real lived community, living within an interconnected community where you see yourself as part of that grand narrative, that can be the most helpful thing of all.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Zargar, for your great answers. We still have a few minutes, so I'll take the liberty as a chair of asking a question myself.
Please.
So you first a comment, I think you beautifully turned Nietzsche's idea of God as artist on its head using Bakhtin. But if you compare the two narratives, like artist who doesn't care and author, what makes your perspective of author as a caring author? I mean, what is the point of considering ourselves as part of a story written by an author if author is seen as just creator of these stories and not care? I mean, how can we add the element of care to this picture? I mean, to make it be completely different to Nietzsche's.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I mean, the easy answer is that is to place it within, you know, the religious context. Because once you, and I would put Ibn Arabi as that context. I mean, Ibn Arabi's commenting on the Quran really in saying that God as author is constantly recreating, and there's this care involved and this love involved, and an infusion of love involved. Outside of that, I think what's interesting is if you get an author who doesn't care, or an author who's diabolical even, right? Some all-powerful being who enjoys suffering, or some all-powerful being who doesn't care about something, just this is the story, and it could end horribly. I hate to answer a question with a question, but I wonder if even that would be a more tolerable life than a life without meaning. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But it's a good question to ask. You could end with that. I mean, I don't see it as that much different. Like when you look at Calvinism, you know, the classical version of some interpretations of Calvinism, where you could, you know, your story could be written and you could be damned to hell, right? It's not that God's evil; it's you just deserved it, right? Mm-hmm. But you're okay with it, right? You're okay with that because so be it. If God wants me to be, you know, if that's how the story ends, at least there was some purpose, you know.
Just trust the author. Thank you so much. We have 2 more minutes. Very quickly, what about moral accountability from that perspective?
So from the perspective that I was talking about.
Yeah. Our life authored by
someone else.
God, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Because so that's where Bakhtin is useful. Because when we think of an author, we think of someone who's imposing their will or imposing their voice upon each of the characters. Bakhtin's great discovery was that in the best novels, the author disappears and brings out of the characters their own individual will and their own individual philosophies. That the true author, the greatest author, is the one who can allow the characters to author the text themselves. And so I think, if anything, you know, we're starting to kind of lean toward that balance between our own autonomy and God's authorship. That is to say, we are these souls, these characters, authoring this story in a way. It's not outside of God's authorship. It's that's what brings to life this dialogue, the dialogical performance that we live in and learn from. So that's what fascinates me most about Bakhtin and why I find him so useful for this discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure everybody has enjoyed your great paper and the conversations. Of course, Amer made another comment or question asking, in reference to my question, can we not say that God is both caring and not caring? I mean, would that work? That kind of paradoxical statement.
I mean, I'll just leave that there because I think deep metaphysical statement too.
Okay, yes. Well, thank you so much. If I don't think I can see any other questions, and we are on time.